Hello, welcome to FX PhD. My name is Matt Leonard and this is class number 9 of arn201. So in this class we're going to be looking at hair and fur, and we're going to be looking at how these work inside of Arnold. Okay, so first off you can see here we are inside of Maya 2014, and we're just going to go up and load in this week's class. So you can see what we're working with, class 09. Okay, so what we have here is a little character that I put together, a kind of a homage to Monsters Incorporated, Monsters University. We've basically got this little character that kind of jumps along with all its hair bouncing and flapping in the wind. Now obviously it doesn't play back too quickly here, so I've done a quick play blast, and let me just show you what that's going to look like. So this is what I've got, and if I just hit play here in RV, you can see that's what the animation is kind of looking like. Nice and fun. Just got a bit of duck fur on the main body, and then this kind of crazy green hair on the top. Okay, so let's just shut down RV. Now if you were just to go ahead and render that using a more traditional older method, you would end up with something like this. So this is my kind of old render. Old meaning that I did this in Mental Ray. Okay, and you can see we're getting a really nice result. Some nice fur, nice hair, etc. Okay, so our job is to take this and bring this in to using Arnold to render this with. Okay, so in order to do that we're going to need to set up a few things. So I'm going to come in and I'm just going to delete some of my old information that we have here, and we're going to start just by setting up our normal Arnold lights. So I'm going to go with a skydome light and an area light. So we'll go with a skydome light here, and let's just move our character to somewhere in the middle, just so we can get a reasonably good position for seeing him. I'm also just going to move across to my camera view, which is pretty similar to where my perspective view was, but let's just keep it roughly where we want to render from. Okay, so that's a great shot there. We've got all the hair going in different directions, and I probably am going to just move to my perspective view for this one, and I'll just zoom on in. Okay, so that's what we're getting, somewhere like that. Okay, so we've set up our Arnold skydome light here, and I'm going to go ahead and add just a HDR into that. So where we've got our color, we're obviously going to come in and we're going to choose a file here. So just click here. This comes across, and we're going to go with an Arnold texture, and we're going to go with a AI image, and we're just going to come in here and choose the file that we want. So for this one I'm going to go with a very traditional Paul de Beverick Grace probe. So you can see that one's here, just in our HDR folder, and we'll just load that one in. Okay, and let's just go ahead and render that, see what we're getting with that set up so far. So we'll switch across to Arnold. Let's just have a look at what size we're going to be rendering this to. So we're going to go with our traditional HD. I'm just going to go with a lowish size at the moment, maybe a height of only 350. Obviously again we don't want to have to wait for renders. I'm going to keep everything else as standard with Arnold for the time being, and just close this up, and let's just do a quick render to see what we're going to get. Okay, so there was our temporary old file. As we're rendering this you can just see what we're getting. Okay, so straight out the box this is what we're getting. It's not so nice. We're obviously missing textures, and we're missing some fur, and the hair looks awful. So what we're going to do is we're going to go in and replace some of these textures obviously with Arnold shaders. So let's do that first of all. So we're going to come across and let's just work through this reasonably quickly. Okay, so first of all let's go with the main body itself. I'm just going to take all these off just for a moment. In fact I'm going to group those Just move those off for a moment. So the main body, if we come across and look, we can see that right at the end it's basically a blin, purple blin, and it's reasonably matte. So I'm going to convert this, or rather make a new Arnold shader that we can use for this. So let's just go ahead and do that. And I thought with this class we'd look at this complete workflow. If you were given something that was from another renderer, I thought that could just be useful, as sometimes that obviously happens and we want to convert from one thing to another. Okay, so I'm going to go with a standard AI standard, but I am going to use subsurface scattering. I'm going to use it within the shader itself. Okay, so we can see pretty much the color we've got going on here, so let's just bring that across. Color, I'm just going to go with that color there. We're going to have just a little bit of specular sheen on this, so we're just going to increase the weight just a tiny bit, really small amount. And it's obviously not a plasticky thing, it's more organic, so we want to have a little bit of roughness, maybe 0.575. We're then going to come down to our subsurface scattering, and the color we're going to use is going to be the purple. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to come in and I'm going to bring that down to be a little bit of a lighter purple color, and I'm going to increase the weight of that. Okay, not a huge amount, maybe 0.3, something like that. And then the radius we're obviously going to need to adjust, so we'll do that in a moment. Because I've got some specular on the skin, I'm going to say maybe there's a tiny little bit of reflection. So again, I'm going to add just a tiny bit of reflection coming in. And other than that, I'm probably going to keep everything else as is. Okay, so let's just come across, we'll grab the main body and we'll just assign that. So right click and assign material. So in order to just check the skin, I'm going to put the body and the light into a render layer. So let's just grab those two, pop that in a render layer temporarily, just so we can see what it looks like, and just go with a IPR. So you can see straight away we're getting a much nicer look to that texture. Okay, so I'm going to run that up, come back to my attribute editor, and while that's going, let's just have a quick adjustment of that subsurface scattering. So again, I'm just going to come across to the texture, down to the subsurface scatter, and let's just have a look at the radius. What have we got at the moment? 0.1. Let's just go up to a middle value, a bit higher. Let's see what we're going to get. So I think probably somewhere like there looks quite nice, maybe a little bit less. Okay, so let's go with that. Let's just now add in the next component, which is, we have our squash and stretch handles. We'll put those all back. We then have the teeth and horns. So we're going to grab all those and they can go back on the body as well. Okay, now the reason why they've appeared in the render layer, even though we haven't added them, is what we actually did when we made our render layer temporarily, was we actually made it with the body in itself, and now we're parenting these other areas, or these other bits and pieces, to the body. They are then appearing in that render layer. Okay, so that's why that's happening. Now let's just have a look what we've got here. We have 3 teeth, 2 horns, and if we just come across now and just look at what we've got taking place, those are just some blins. Okay, so let's just have a look at whether that's rendering to something that looks half decent. If it does, we'll then focus in on the eye mainly. Okay, so I can see that's looking pretty nice. The only thing that I would be tempted to change is probably the reflection. So I'm just going to come in and drop that down quite considerably. So 0.05. That's for the horn. Teeth is the, again, is going to need to come down to 0.1 maybe. That's the same. That's the same. And this one here, 0.9. 0.65. Try and keep things a little bit varied just so we don't have exactly the same texture on everything. That then brings us finally to the eye. So if we just open up the eye, you can see that we have our main 4 areas: the white of the eye, the cornea, the iris and the pupil. So let's just go with the white of the eye first. You can see that is using a Fong E. We have the corneal, which is using a Fong E. Fong E also for the iris and the pupil. We come across, we can see that's just a Lambert because that's just a solid black texture. So if we come back to our render here and just do a bounding box render, you can see really all we're getting is this big black area. So we really want to go in and we want to rebuild this eye using proper Arnold shaders, which are going to give us a much nicer result. Okay, so I'm going to start again just by opening up my hyper shader, and we're going to work from kind of the back forward. So the first thing we've got is obviously our white. So if we come in here, we can see it's literally just a white with a nice bit of specular on it. So we're going to go with a Arnold AI. There's our standard. We're going to go with, if we just scoot down, a weight of maybe 0.85 for that. Give it a nice bit of white. We want some specular highlight, but because it's the white of the eye, it's very wet. We're going to bring that roughness down just to give it a bit of shine. And also we're obviously interested in having some reflection as well. So I'm going to set that to about 0.3, something like that. Okay, so there's our eye. So let's just come in, select that, and right click and assign. Let's budge this over a little bit. Okay, so that's the first bit done. Next up we have the cornea, and if we zoom on in, we can see that is the main kind of area here. Then we have the iris and the pupil. So the corneal is really just kind of this glass look. So for that, I'm literally just going to add a glass shader. We'll see how far that gets us straight off the bat. So let's just come across here. Let's just zoom out until we can find some glass. There we have our glass. Again, just grab the cornea and go ahead and just use that glass we just brought in. There it is. So cornea, right click, assign that glass material to that. And we're just going to check it to see exactly what we're getting. So you can see we've got black color, that's going to be fine. We've got specular, no roughness, so our glass is going to be very shiny as we would expect. Reflection, no reflection for that. And then the refraction, if we come down, you can see that we're getting an index of refraction of 0.5. Now originally when I set this up, I used an index of refraction, if we just come down to here, of 1.1. So I'm just going to bring that across as well. 1.1. Okay, so that's pretty much ready to go. Let's now come across and have a look at the pupil. Now the pupil is actually using a texture map, so we can just come across here. You can see here we've got a Fong E, and this is the texture map we're using, which is just this nice map here. So again, I'm going to use an AI standard. We're going to go with the color, which we're going to add in a texture map, which is obviously going to be a AI image. And in here, we'll just grab from our source images that iris. Okay, now again, we just move back to the shader. We're going to need some specular information on that. And I want to try and keep the specular information the same as we were getting with the white of the eye. Okay, so we want to scoot down to where that was. That was here. And you can see we had a weight of say 0.3 0.35, and then let's say 0.25 for the actual roughness. So again, if we come across to here, 0.25 and a weight of 0.3 here. Okay, and again, we're just going to assign that directly onto the eye. Now, having made these changes, we're not going to be knowing whether this is going to be right or not, so best thing we can do is come in and do a quick render. Okay, so what we can see here in the middle, straight off the bat, is that obviously we have forgotten to change this into being a translucent material. So let's just go ahead and do that first of all. I'm just going to grab the cornea, come down to our Arnold section, obviously under our shape, and just turn off opaque. Okay, call that up. And let's just now do another quick render. And now we can see that green coming through, and that's looking pretty nice. So let's just stop that. Let's zoom back so we can see our whole character, obviously without the fur, somewhere like that. And let's do our final test render for this. Okay, so that's what we're getting. So it's looking really nice, really pleased with that. Maybe the subsurface scattering isn't quite where we want it, so I may come back and make an adjustment to that in a minute, but for the time being, I'm just going to leave it there. So let's now focus in on the next section, which is obviously dealing with the hair. So we're going to come across, and I'm just going to delete that render layer. Served its purpose, we can get rid of it now. And let's just move this down so that we now can see the hair. Okay, so first thing we're going to do is we're going to take the hair, and let's look at some of the options that we have inside of Arnold for dealing with the hair itself. Okay, so the first thing to note, if we open up the attribute editor and we look at the hair system that comes with Maya, we scoot down to the Arnold section. Right at the bottom you can see that we have this hair shader. This is where we need to actually add an Arnold shader into this section. Okay, so I'm going to go across to our hyper shader, and we're going to come across to our Arnold shaders here, and we're going to go with a AI hair. Now with this you can see that we have quite a lot of settings that we can adjust. We have our diffuse, our specular, we have the opacity of the hair, and then the normal kind of AOVs and things like that that we've looked at in the past. So the first thing we've got is our root and tip color. Okay, so and we know that we want this to be this kind of crazy kind of green color here. So let's say the root color is a kind of a dark green coming out. So let's just come in here and let's choose a darker green, something there maybe. And then the actual tip color, that's where it really goes. This kind of crazy greeny, yellowy day glow color. Okay, so somewhere there. So we've got a root color and a tip color. We've then got the ambient, diffuse and indirect diffuse contributions for the matte. So I'm going to say that we want the indirect to be just a small amount, 0.1, and the ambient we're going to set to 0.8. Let's see how that's going to look. We then have the specular, and here we have the overall glossiness, and as I increase that you can see we get this really nice kind of anisotropic highlights running around here. So I'm going to bring this up. You can adjust the weight if you want to take that down, but I quite like it like that. The color I'm going to make kind of a yellowy green color. Kind of a bit of a weird color, yellowy greeny white, something like that. Okay, so just a hint of something going on there. Shift, as we've seen before, we can use this to kind of rotate this round. I'm going to leave it as is. That's going to be as accurate as we're going to want it. And the glossiness, well, let's make it not entirely like a shampoo advert. Let's make it a little bit more glossy, where it's more blurred than we might specifically like if we were going for something more glamorous. Okay, so that's going to be the hair setup. Now, if we come back to our hair itself, we can now middle drag our AI hair into this hair shader section here. So we can drop that in and that then connects up. Okay, so in the node editor you can see exactly what we're getting. So I get my node editor here, and let's just do the in-out connections. And so we don't have too much going on, let's just focus backwards from our Arnold shader. So again, I'm just going to grab the Arnold shader, and if we grab the hair and the hair system, you can see this is now the connection that we've got. Okay, so a little bit more straightforward. So the out color of the AI hair is going directly into the AI hair shader of the hair system here. Okay, now you can obviously go wild and expand this out as we saw before, but we really don't need to get into that much detail for just the connections that we've made here. Okay, so from here, let's now do another render so we can see what we're getting with our Arnold shader now driving our Maya hair. Now you can see that it still looks a complete mess. And the reason why is because of one thing that we forgot to do. And that was, if we again come back down to where we dropped in the shader, it's really important that just above it, there's this override hair button here. And you just want to make sure that that is clicked on, okay? Otherwise, we're not going to get anything coming through. Okay, so again, I'm just going to grab the top of the head. And let's just do a render of that. And what we'll now see is Arnold completely replacing that. And immediately you can see this is now looking much nicer. Okay, so there is our specular running through. Now at this point, I'd probably put the IPR back on. And we want to focus in just on the hair. Let's call up our hyper shader again and just adjust that specular. Okay, so we'll load in our hair, make sure we've got that selected. You can see now as we come in and we adjust the glossiness, if we put it up, immediately see that now that specular becomes much more kind of defined in the way it's running around the hair. So we're going to drop it down maybe a little bit more, maybe somewhere around 750 might be a good number to start with. Okay, there we go. Right, so from here, let's now do a full render so we can actually see what this is looking like. And to do that, I'm just going to increase my AAs overall just to get a slightly nicer quality. So I'm going to take my AAs from 3 up to 5. Okay, close out IPR, and let's now do a full render. We'll come back and talk about what's happening with the eye in a moment. Okay, so that's just finishing off. You can see I fixed the eye. Somehow, I don't quite know how, the eye reverted back to all the old Maya shaders. So I'll just quickly put the Arnold ones back on. But you can see the hair now is looking really nice. And I also did just tweak the subsurface scattering slightly, brought it down a bit on the main body. You can see that here. Brought the weight down slightly and the radius down quite a lot, but that's given us a much nicer result. Okay, so that's the hair. Now what more can we do with the hair? Because obviously we haven't covered everything we can do with it. So let's just grab the hair and let's come across again to Arnold here. Well, firstly, we've got this mode here, ribbon, thickness, or oriented, and we know that we talked about these earlier when we talked about rendering curves, because that's really a very similar way to how Arnold deals with the hair. Then we have this minimum pixel width, and if you remember again with the curve, this is basically the minimum pixel width that you can basically have this hair render to. So for instance, if you get very, very small thin hair, in order to get the anti-aliasing to work, you really need to push up the AAs to quite a considerable amount, maybe 10, 15, something like that. And obviously that's going to cause your render to really slow down. So what you can do is you can basically set a minimum pixel width on your hair. So if the camera zooms back, you basically end up with hair always being a minimum size. So let me give you an example. If I leave the pixel width at 0. This is obviously what we're going to get, and I'm just going to save this down. But if I was to increase this to a minimum pixel width of, say, 2 pixels, that will mean, if we just zoom on in here, that no hair can get smaller than 2 pixels. And you can see here that some of this is going to be fall into that category. Now, just in case it's not, I'm going to go a bit crazy and push it up to 3. Okay, so let's reset this to the real size. Let's just grab the hair, and with the pixel width set to a minimum of 3 pixels, let's do a re-render, and you'll immediately see the difference that this makes. And as I said, the reason that you might want to use this is just so that you can drop your AAs down, because you're basically putting in a rule that says your hair won't get to this kind of thin setup, so that you end up needing a lot of AAs in order to get it to look very smooth. Okay, so this is like a cheat way of basically saying, even if the camera zooms a long way back, make sure that the pixel width of each hair is at a minimum 1 pixel or 3 pixels or whatever it is you're setting it to. Okay, so I'll finish letting this render through, and then we'll have a look at the result. Okay, so that's finished up, and you can see with it set to a minimum pixel width of 3, you're really seeing the difference. So that's what it's set when it's left to its own devices, and that's what it looks like when you say whatever happens, the minimum pixel width that you might need would be 3 pixels. Now what I would do is I would tend to leave this round at about 0.4, 0.5, 0.6, something like that. That seems to be a reasonably good value, so about half a pixel in size. So obviously if you are closer than that and your hair is going to be thicker, then that's fine and we don't need to worry about it. But as I said, if the camera moves far enough away for you really to get ultra thin hair that really is going to need a lot of AAs in order to get that to look nice, then this is a method in which you can keep the hair pushed up to a sensible size and therefore reduce your AAs, therefore reducing your render time. Now it's probably worth noting that this whole minimum pixel width that we've been talking about is only supported when you're using the ribbon mode. Okay, so if you use anything else, thick or oriented, neither of those are going to then work. This will just be completely ignored. Okay, so ribbon is really probably the best option you want to go with. So I'm going to leave that back at 0.5, and let's just do one more final render of this before we move on to talk about fur. And also, while this is rendering, let me just point out with regards to hair, the same as we've talked about with other subjects, if you want the if you want the hair to be motion blurred, just like with particles, we actually need to cache those. Okay, so the hair needs to be cached in order for the motion blur to work effectively, the same as it did with the particles, because the motion blur needs to be able to understand frames, not only the one it's rendering, but in front and behind. So if you're rendering frame 5, we need the cache because the motion blur needs to also be able to look at potentially frame 4 and 6 as well, and if not more, depending on obviously how many frames the motion blur is working over. Okay, so we'll let this finish rendering through, and then as I said, we'll have a discussion about fur. Okay, so you can see that's finished up rendering, getting a really nice result. So from here, let's now go across and look at the Maya fur. So on our original system, we had 2 lots of fur. We had our duckling fur and our polar bear fur. Now, how do we get this to render inside of Arnold? Well, unfortunately, the very short answer is we can't do it. At the moment, Arnold does not support Maya fur whatsoever. However, there are some alternatives. One alternative would be to basically split the render. Now, this obviously isn't a particularly brilliant idea, but one that you could adopt if needed. So in this example, I basically rendered out the main creature as an Arnold render. I've then rendered out the fur and an ambient occlusion pass using Mental Ray. I've then rendered out the hair on top of the character's head, again with Arnold, and then I've composited all those passes together inside of Nuke. Okay, so this is one option to go with. Probably isn't the best idea, but it is an idea that could potentially get you out of a hole if you needed to. Now, if you didn't want to do that, there are a number of other options you could go with. A couple of those are plugins. Firstly, there is Shave and a Haircut, created by Joe Alter. And Joe used to be at ILM, so he's got a great pedigree in the visual effects industry. His plugin costs about $500. It's been around for quite a long time, runs on all the main OSs and runs with all the main render engines, and it's been used really quite extensively by some of the big boys out there, people like Weta, Sony, Double Neg, Phil Tippett Studios and Prime Focus have all used it for feature film production. One of the last times you would have probably seen it would have been in World War Z. They used it there for doing the zombies and things like that, for some of the hair. So that would be one option that you could go with. A second option would be to go with Peregrine Labs' hair system, and that is called Yeti. Now this is a little bit more, obviously twice as much, $1,200. Hasn't been around for quite so long, and it isn't supported by quite so many render engines, but all the main ones that you would want to support are there: RenderMan, Arnold, 3Delight and V-Ray. And this has again been used by quite a number of large companies, so people like Framestore, CineSight, FinDesign, Ghost VFX, some pretty massive companies there have all been using this Peregrine Labs Yeti system. And Peregrine Labs have got a very, very good pedigree behind them. Obviously, one of the founders of Peregrine Labs is Colin Doncaster, and Colin just won this year an Academy Award for his work on deep compositing. And they also released another plugin along with Yeti, which is called Bokeh, which uses deep compositing data to actually get some really nice depth of field effects. Now the third option you could go with is a system that is about to be released with Maya 2015 called XGen. And you may have read about this, it's been talked about in the press over the last few years, originally developed over at Walt Disney Studios. And it's been used on a number of pretty massive feature films: Bolt, Up, Toy Story 3, Tangled and Cars 2. And this is both a hair system and can also be used for placing things like vegetation or rocks, trees, anything you can imagine over landscapes very organically. So this is another option. It's obviously going to be coming out, as you can see, in 2015 release of Maya, which as of recording is due out in about 4 weeks time. But if you've been on the Advantage subscription pack for Maya 2014, then you also would have had it in that. Okay, and I get the feeling really that XGen is going to be pretty big over the coming years, so it's definitely something to be looking at. And this is fully supported by Arnold already, so that is yet another alternative if you want to be using fur inside of Maya. So that is really as far as we're going to go with this class. We've covered all of the main features for hair inside of Arnold and Maya. Next week, our final week, is kind of a miscellaneous class. We're going to be looking at a whole host of different things, so it's going to be a pretty interesting class, and I look forward to seeing you then. So until then, until week 10, as always, this has been Matt Leonard for FX PhD.